what I want to do is to share with you a paper that's from current research that I'm doing. And it's research where I'm really trying to put to work post-humanist, feminist, new materialist theory. I'm really trying to think quite carefully, what does that look like? How does research look? What do we do when we're in the field, when we're putting these theories to work? So specifically what I'm looking at is, in this paper, is Haraway's figure of the mutated modest witness and her successor science, and wondering what might that make possible? How might research be different if we work with those concepts? And hopefully I'll start to unpack some of that as I go through. But if I reach the end and you still don't know what I'm talking about, which is possible, then we can carry on discussing it. But Haraway is my go-to philosopher at the moment. Okay, so in this paper, what I do is, and in the research, is to turn attention to everyday habits, ordinary routines, and mundane materials that you routinely find in early childhood contexts. And they're awash with these routine habits and processes and matter, and it's the matter that I'm interested in also. So why do I do this? I spent quite a long time critiquing and deconstructing and problematizing, and I still think there's a very important need to do that in the field of early childhood. But what I want to do is kind of guess beyond that, to think about how our research can be more generative. So yes, we need to critique and deconstruct and problematize, but we then also need to think, what next? Where do we go with this? So what I'm attempting to do is how I enact a feminist new materialist philosophy in my current research. And I illustrate how this makes thinking about our relational entanglements in early childhood more expansive. So by focusing on very small moments and entanglements of matter and affect and spaces and places and bodies, we can have a much more opened out, what Haraway would term worldly engagement with early childhood and our sense of the child. So I offer a speculative account of what Donna Haraway's figure of the mutated modest witness and her practice of situated knowledges makes possible. I argue that rather than diminishing humanist concerns, this framework offers the means to exercise a heightened ethical responsibility. So there are critiques and criticisms waged against post-humanist research that is concerned to decenter the human, that the human falls out of view, and I don't concur with that. I think that the human is still there, but we turn our attention to the human in relation to everything else, and that enables us to think differently. And this is what Haraway terms our worldly responsibility, where the researcher is attuned to so much more than only the human actors. And this is quite a challenge for early childhood research, because with child-centered pedagogies and child-centered research, to suggest that you dare to decenter the human subject, it feels quite risky, and why would you? Well, hopefully I'll go on to illustrate why I think that is a good thing to do. So this approach celebrates what feminist new materialism offers as a means to generate new ways to think about and be in the world. So it goes beyond the early childhood context. Okay. So following Haraway, I want to argue for a successor science that reworks ideas about observation, researcher objectivity, and that recognizes and in fact celebrates researchers' place as entangled and implicated. We're not separate from that which we research. We are totally in the thick of it. And rather than seeing that as something to control, it's something to embrace and to see as a resource, actually. Our entanglement and our implication is really what we should be working with. So for the mutate... the more than human intervening. So for the mutated modest witness, matters of concern are encountered, sensed, and produced through haptic moments, bodily moments of movement in early childhood. So researching in this mode insists that we go beyond representation or giving voice, which has been the mainstay of a lot of research, feminist research and childhood research, towards being in the thick of things and actively participating in world-making processes. So I find this quote by Carol Taylor and Gabrielle Ivinson particularly helpful. It sounds quite simple, but it is kind of the shift that we're seeking to make. By properly recognising that we have no bird's-eye position from which to look back or down at our world, we have to take seriously our own messy, implicated, connected, embodied involvement in knowledge production. So that, in a nutshell, is what I'm attempting to do. So the promises offered by feminist new materialism has invited me to consider how else research might be undertaken in more socially engaged, generative, and hopeful ways. Consequently, following Jeanette Redding-Jones, what counts as research and what counts as valid knowledge, following Patty Lather, and what gets included within our frames of inquiry, following Betty St-Pierre, have become considerably rethought. So putting feminist new materialism to work has invited a more entangled, immersed approach to research that insists that I recognise my relational entanglement in early childhood context, and that the concern is not to capture accounts that represent what I think I see and what I think I know, but rather embracing uncertainty and not knowing, and this is not knowing with a K in brackets, the naughty knowing, new knowledge and practices can emerge. So I've been grappling with what going beyond the human subject and bringing materiality and affect more forcibly into the frame of my investigations might mean for politically motivated research. I remain a feminist researcher, and I remain troubled by inequalities of all kinds, and I want that to be part of the research that I do. So capitalism, patriarchy, sexism, racism, class prejudice, those are things that I still want to explore through my research, and because they have a very real bearing on experiences of childhood and therefore concerns that I want to keep central. Yet, feminist new materialism makes clear the limits of human exceptionalism. It's not enough only to attend to humanist matters of concern. We have an ethical responsibility, following Haraway, to recognise and take account of our entangled place in the world. We can bring this sensibility to our everyday lives and to the research that we undertake. And I think that's really what I have found from several years of working within a post-humanist frame, is it doesn't stop when you leave the fieldwork site. This is kind of, it seeps into your life and it alters the way in which you live your life. So yeah, it's about children's entanglements with spaces, materials, memories, affects, bodies, sounds, and smells in a quest for more livable worlds. And that all sounds quite abstract, a little bit crazy, but I'm hoping that I will start to illustrate how that's possible. So I report on a study that seeks to reconfigure approaches to studying diversity, difference, multiculturalism, those sort of mainstays of early childhood practice, with a heightened ethical responsibility, a worldly responsibility. So in order to do this as a researcher, I must be attuned to so much more than only the human actors in any given scenario. So taking a small number of embodied, material, affective events and haptic moments from one London nursery, and making materiality my starting place, I offer a generative account of seeking to work with the figure of the mutated modest witness. For Haraway, modest witnessing is about reworking and mutating established ideas and practices about how to do research, what science is. Her figure of the mutated modest witness is a practice of critical scholarship that involves our own, as well as other, bodies, materialities, knowledges, politics, ethics, truths, and crucially, it's a hopeful practice. So we go back to her groundbreaking essay in 1997, where Haraway playfully attempts to refigure science's masculine modest witness. She's committed to reworking what she terms polluted histories and practices, namely those that are readily associated with particularly positivist research, but objectivity, which is achieved through embodied presence of the scientist as witness, as bearing testament in some sense to truth knowledge production, that you are outside of that which you are experimenting with, or the knowledge you're producing, which she terms the God trick. So in Modest Witness, Haraway presents a robust critique of modern experimental science, particularly as it was performed in laboratories at the Royal Society in London, in the mid-17th century, and which leaves imprints still upon dominant modes of knowledge production. We still see this quest for objectivity and sitting outside that which we research. At that time, experimental science was built upon a form of modest witnessing that was open to only a very narrow selection of people, namely white, upper middle class English gentlemen of social standing and with quality of mind, and therefore deemed the best qualified and well placed to establish objective matters of fact. So this mode of modest witnessing produced specific gendered subjectivities, what she terms masculine modesty, and an associated and very specific version of masculine objectivity. So objective scientific knowledge rested upon boundaries and standards, and central to these was the scientist, an impartial, embodied, present being who could see, hear, record events that took place within the laboratory without sullying that knowledge. So scientific events were considered nothing more than the materialization of the object, and as such, valid, truthful representations. And this mode of inquiry established that the testimonies of qualified modest witnesses would ensure that matters of objective fact were discovered and secured. So these scientific practices set up distinctions between insider and outsider, where the insider science is characterized by careful empirical observation, meticulous record keeping, high seriousness, and reasoned arguments. We see traces of this still in the dominant mode of undertaking research, and still in randomized control trials and the kind of dominant ways of doing research are, we still see these characteristics. By contrast, outsider science is shaped by culture, society, politics, religion, ideology, imprecision, intuition, desire, and common sense, all of which act to degrade and pollute true knowledge. The privileging of insider scientific practices produced a peculiar kind of modesty framed by a commitment to remain at a distance, to work objectively and transparently within experimental processes, to allow objects of nature to speak through the scientists as if uncontaminated by culture. The lab then becomes what Haraway terms the theatre of persuasion. Animated by a politics of representation, knowledge becomes a representational practice that presents scientists as apolitical, as detached, as masculine, as modern. Meanwhile, everyone else is marked as other, as engaging in some form of non-legitimate outsider science. So the spaces where science experiments took place were restricted so that who could be a modest witness was gendered, raced, and classed. Women were not allowed, too faint of heart. So accepting this model of scientific practice permits a limited version of objectivity as beyond question, since it's both universal and given to nature. Haraway in 1988 is at pains to deconstruct this narrative in order to imagine a more critical science committed to situated knowledges, and situated knowledge is a fundamental aspect of Haraway's philosophy that has served feminists well for a very long time, and something that I'm working with currently. And where the practice of credible witnessing remains in place. For Haraway, situated knowledges enable partial perspective. So this is where she's doing the mutating of the modest witness. She's not ready to throw out these kind of cornerstones of scientific research of knowledge, perspective, objectivity, and truth, but she's reclaiming them and mutating them. And these are features of the successor science she argues for a science framed by feminist politics. So Haraway's Mutated Modest Witness is a project of reworking, maybe I'm ahead of myself again, knowledge, perspective, objectivity, and truth. She contests how science is framed, practiced, and its relevance in real worlds from which it emerges and to which it's always connected. She argues that witnessing and modesty are practices too important to leave out of science, but the point is to figure out what each might mean in a successor science that would take democracy, freedom, partiality, location, and accountability more seriously. A feminist modesty, then, requires asking difficult questions about race, class, gender, and sex, with the goal of making a difference in the world. Haraway's successor science and figure of the mutated modest witness work against the God trick. She argues for feminist objectivity characterized by situated knowledges that is about knowing, seeing, sensing, witnessing, attesting, and speaking as a particular body that's located in a particular time and place, both literally and relationally. And this reworked, remodeled conceptualization of objectivity is never innocent or unproblematic because it's always partial, situated, located, and therefore accountable. Our seeing, sensing, and being in the world is always located, active, and specific, and recognizing this allows for more truthful knowledge of the worlds to emerge. So Haraway's concept of worldling, which she develops in 2008, stresses that worlds are multiple, partial, located, contradictory, overlapping, messy, and always in process. And they only become more visible as a world when they are fabricated through stories that can then be partially shared and collectively lived as truths, albeit momentarily. We can do this, she argues, by exercising loving care. These are not things readily associated with positivist science. And responsibility, the ability to respond in each micro moment that involves paying careful, loving attention to how others see, hear, and know, all of which is central to a better way of doing science. So, I think I've covered that. With this theoretical framing in place, what I'm going to seek to do is to illustrate how the figure of the mutated modest witness and practices of feminist objectivity can find expression to stretch and rework ideas and practices surrounding multiculturalism in early childhood. As Haraway states of her SF philosophy, SF is a methodological proposal. It is a toolkit for thinking, feeling, storying, relating to be taken up, used, modified, offered, shared, whatever. So I take up her invitation, this methodological proposal, as a means to attempt research differently, in a way that allows for feminist objectivity, partial perspective, and situated knowledges to generate other stories about childhood. So the partial situated location of the investigation I want to share with you unfolds within the toddler room in a North London nursery on a damp and drizzly Wednesday afternoon in December. Ladybird Room is an otherworldly space, a dwelling, a pedagogical home occupied by 3- and 4-year-old children, adult educators, and a host of non-human and more than human agents. A look around Ladybird Room reveals it to be an all too familiar environment to the early childhood researcher. However, engaging in practices of mutated modest witnessing refigures it as a sensorium rich with possibilities to tell otherworldly stories about childhood. Through its familiarity, the space and all its inhabitants become extraordinary and offer endless possibilities to reimagine early childhood education and how multiculturalism and diversity might be encountered differently through process ontology. Observing the routine every day, material discursive entanglements unfolding and enfolding within the room creates space for other stories to emerge in unexpected and unanticipated ways. Through socially engaged practices of deep hanging out and a willingness to venture off the beaten path, these are Haraway's methods. I have a PhD student who's currently cited those as his research methods. The ethics committee was curious. So I'm presented with multiple sticky knots with which to reconfigure ideas and practices about multiculturalism in early childhood. So exercising an open-ended speculative approach to research in early childhood is difficult to explain to the staff. So I arrive at the nursery and I am immediately taken to a wall display, a map of the world, with photos of children's faces superimposed upon the country from which their families originated, then a chart displaying all the languages spoken, and various photo displays of children engaged in learning about other cultures. And I'm gifted a copy of the outstanding Ofsted inspection report that provides further evidence of the ways in which the nursery facilitates and embraces multiculturalism. And finally, I'm given an information sheet prepared by a parent about festivals and celebrations at home. And whilst these artefacts and accounts volunteered by staff are interesting representations, my concern is to engage in practices of mutated modest witnessing so that I might sense, hear, smell, see multiculturalism as it manifests through everyday encounters within microscopic events. So what I'm going to do is to share an excerpt from my field notes where my own, as well as other bodies, materialities, knowledges, politics, ethics and truth unfurl and interweave to produce other ways to encounter multiculturalism. I then conclude by endeavouring to pull at strings that offer a speculative account of what else is going on when we allow ourselves to ask what if, and so work beyond the limitations of recognition and representation. So here we go. Hair and chair. Within seconds of settling onto a too-small chair in Ladybird Room, two children, let's call them Anna and Elsa, have introduced themselves to me. Anna begins stroking my hair in an inquisitive way. Both girls are Black British and have their hair in braided cornrows. They seem preoccupied by the texture, colour and length of my hair and continue lifting and stroking it, whilst engaging me in enthusiastic conversation. They tell me their names, that they understand I'm an expert about Christmas, and that they're expecting me and really pleased that I have come. McDonald's, church, sequins, and Disney princesses. The whole time the girls are making star collages, they talk busily, telling me about their lives, their likes. Elsa tells me that she goes to Christchurch, where they sing and are getting ready for Christmas. But the best thing about going is the trip to McDonald's on the way home. I'm asked if I like McDonald's more than Christmas. Do I have a McDonald's near my home? The questions are in quick succession that I barely have a chance to answer, which is a relief, as I don't like McDonald's and actively avoid going there or ever taking my children there. But I don't share this with them, rather I offer that I think there probably is a McDonald's near where I live. Elsa then shows me where artwork goes to dry, on a rack in the corner. Then she's back at the table, gluing another star and talking avidly to me about Disney princesses. They are illustrated on the beakers that hold the sequins they are gluing. A dinner invitation, home corner, chairs, mirrors, domesticity. A little while later, Anna takes my notebook and decides that she is a waitress and takes my food order. Then Elsa comes over and takes the notebook and my pen and begins to write, asking me what day it is. The girls then take it in turns to write on my notebook and appear to have absolutely no intention of returning it. Then I'm invited to come to dinner. I'm taken over to the home corner and I quickly realise I will not fit in the dining chairs placed around the table that have arms on the sides and are not intended for adult bodies. So I pull up one of the stacking, still too small chairs and sit at the edge of home corner. My seat is opposite a mirror above a wash basin and to the side of a makeshift wall with a reflective surface. I catch sight of myself and my ridiculously long legs. My knees are almost at my ears, and I attempt to fold myself into this other too small chair. I think of Alice in Wonderland as I'm offered a plastic chicken to eat. Anna has consulted the food order in my notebook and determines that I ordered cake as well, but we will need to make that from scratch. She brings over a large lump of the green sparkling Play-Doh and jams it into a metal teapot. The cake making and sharing goes on for some time, and I am required to sample it. Again, I catch sight of the scene in the reflective surfaces, struck by my adult body in a simulated miniature otherworld, a world of domesticity and make-believe, familiar and strange at the same time. Magical realism, cake, candles. Anna and I are regularly consulting about what is real, what is pretend, what is magic. I don't have to really eat the cake, but I do have to blow out the make-believe candles, but not yet, because they are not alight. Without verbalising, it's clear that Anna has a bright idea as she springs up from her chair, eyes wide, brows raised. She purposefully scampers off and returns with the empty shaving foam can and applies the foam remaining on the nozzle to each of the pipe cleaner candles. She can't find the right word, lighter, match, but knows instinctively what the can has become. But soon the foam fire is used up, but not all the candles have been lit. She instructs me to light the rest of the candles, reminding me it's a Christmas cake. It may have candles, but it's not a birthday cake, but a magical Christmas cake. I ask what's magic about it, and I'm told it disappears. Talking gobble, Elsa then rejoins us. She is wearing a purple conical party hat as a unicorn horn and has 2 boggly eyes still attached to her cheeks. In all seriousness, she begins to chat with me again, asking questions about my home and whether I have a Christmas tree and which decoration is my favourite. Then the conversation moves to her grandparents, 2 nanas, 1 granddad. In the few spaces left for me to answer, I attempt to keep up with the shifts in her questioning. They both begin to snort and giggle. Why do you talk like that? Elsa asks. Like what? Different, just different. You talk gobble, that's it, gobble. I ask what gobble is, and it seems that my accent is not like theirs, or any of the children, or the educators. It's gobble, and it's funny. Drink me, eat me. Elsa flits off again, and Anna has decided that we need a drink to go with our cake. She takes a plastic bottle from the shopping basket, which was once a bottle of nail varnish remover. I have another fleeting Alice-like thought about the potential dangers of drinking toxic substances, but it's clear that this is water to pretend drink. Anna moves over to the hand basin and looks around her using the mirror to scan the room, as if to check the coast is clear. I suspect she might be breaking certain rules, playing with water in the non-designated water playing area probably. But she's confident and comes back to the table and begins to pour the water into the Disney princess beakers in which the small dollops of Play-Doh and sequins sit. I'm instructed to drink, and I pretend to do so. Anna returns to the basin several times, and then she's caught in the act. As she overfills the metal teapot with water, it trickles over the table, and the Play-Doh floats on top of a puddle of water that shouldn't be there. An educator comes over and begins to rehearse the rules about not playing with water in home corner. What a mess. I feel that I'm being included in the gentle reprimand. The brimming teapot is taken away and its contents poured down the sink. I can spy a concealed look of exasperation in the mirror above the basin. Meanwhile, Anna and I take paper towels from the dispenser and begin absorbing the puddle. The structure of the towels is transformed from stiff, crisp, dry rectangles to soggy, disintegrating, cold, mushy balls. We both sense that this signals the end of the game. So, what else? My intention here is not to offer a deconstruction or interpretation of what these moments from research might mean, or to identify evidence of multiculturalism in early childhood contexts. Rather, my concern is to grapple with what else gets produced through practices of mutated modest witnessing. Whilst there are clearly human actors in these scenes, Elsa, Anna, myself, and the educator, the other non-human and more than human actors work together to produce affects that linger still, confusion, judgment, thrill, and musing, to borrow from Kathleen Stewart. I want to argue that such ordinary affects can be productive in how we come to figure with materiality and affects so as to think more intensely and more responsibly. Within these scenes, the liveliness of matter, borrowing from Jane Bennett, is sensed, and it's possible to trace how various agents, chair, hair, Play-Doh, water, together with research and child bodies, space and time, activate multiple intensities and forces, unpredictable fault lines, and energetic currents. Through these entangled encounters, resonances were provoked, memories agitated across and within bodies. For example, gobble transported me back to previous research situations where social class signifiers such as accent, hairstyle, choice of clothes produced uncomfortable affects. In that gobble moment, I was transported to other points throughout my own childhood into adulthood that have been marked by uncomfortable affective processes of social mobility. Further, gobble worked on me to dwell upon the privileged white middle-classness that my own children inhabit. These strange encounters with routine and everyday happenings in Ladybird Room interrupted and fractured the familiarity of being in a nursery. Having undertaken research in nurseries for over 20 years, there's a predictability and easy recognition of the organisation of space, furniture, and materials. Yet taking up the figure of the mutated modest witness made this simple mundane acts of talking and sitting something else altogether. When bodies are out of place, out of time and excessive, it becomes possible to encounter early childhood education differently. The too small chairs contort adult bodies and therefore insist the researcher's sensibilities become reconfigured as mutated modest witnesses in nursery spaces. So sensing and noticing ridiculously long legs whilst embarking upon a feast of plastic chicken generates discomfort and awkwardness. Such sensations that I must recognise my emplacement, that I am infected and affected by the extraordinary in early childhood. In these encounters, matters of fact, including those relating to chairs, accent, Play-Doh, and the texture, length, colour of human hair, interacted with matters of concern and matters of care, which generated resonances and dissonances. This mode of inquiry demands that the researcher be open to the queerness that resides in spaces where habits, magic, and fantasy commingle with regulation, containment, and surveillance. This was acutely felt in Home Corner, a deeply familiar zone in early years settings. It's been the subject of feminist critique for many years for reinscribing gender stereotypes. Yet being open to what else might unfold in this simulated space of domestication offers interesting surprises. The vital materialism, Bennett, of the various objects within the space created opportunities for surging capacities to affect and to be affected. Within these micro-moments, something was released. A ceaseless motion of relations, scenes, contingencies, and emergencies unfolded. Sensations, expectations, wonderings, memories, and habits were set in motion. To be affected in this way provoked endless questions. Questions about children, childhood, and life in the Anthropocene, and the significance of our worldling practices as they unfold within the everyday scenes of Ladybird Room. Practices of mutated modest witnessing demand deep hanging out and a willingness to be immersed and infected by life in child-sized world. Taking up an Alice in Wonderland sensibility, working with the affects of discomfort, awkwardness, excess, and being out of place, is generative and provides a portal through which to unsettle established ideas about childhood and difference. Such deep immersion unsettles and expands ideas about the ways in which policies, curriculum frameworks, and pedagogical practices play out. By focusing on the seemingly unremarkable and routine every day, it becomes possible to attune our ethical responsibility. Close attention to what unfolds in early childhood contexts can tell us so much about children's place within the world and their participation in world-making practices. So what I'm advocating, or I guess I'm stressing, is that taking up childlike inquisitiveness and curiosity in our research practices involves a willingness to create alternative, otherworldly, magical stories that are corporeal, sensory, and haptic, and inconclusive. Affective methodologies such as that offered through mutated modest witnessing recognizes our entangled place. As Alemo says, the material self cannot be disentangled from networks that are simultaneously economic, political, cultural, scientific, substantial. What was once an ostensibly bounded human subject finds herself in a swirling landscape of uncertainties, and that's where I found myself in those micro moments. So to conclude, I want to stress that the mutated modest witness is not an innocent bystander gathering representational accounts of the world out there. Rather, she's implicated and invested. As Kathleen Stewart urges, it is to the productive potential of the everyday, the ordinary, the habitual, the routine, and otherwise unremarkable that we must pay attention. As my observations attest, early childhood contexts are extraordinarily ordinary, excessive, and effectively charged. We need to attend to close examinations of what these extraordinary moments, objects, materializations, and entanglements make possible when we consider childhood and how childhood gets produced. Thank you.
I think we need some time for deep hanging out. We're just going to open, thank you for that, Jane. We're just going to open the floor for any questions, comments, queries. Anybody?
My name's and I'm involved in many ways in Pacific and Indigenous a sort of representationalist view, and you know, I can sense the tension at times as you talk through it and you express, you know, the sensations felt under the skin, and you know, that relationality as well with the children. But I want to return back to one of your first, I think it might have been your second or third slide, which presented an image of a lab. Black and white image, I think. This image in particular. And the power of knowledge that you talk about in knowledge production. And engaging here with new materialism and post-humanist philosophy, I'm really interested in indigenous philosophy in this particular space in terms of confronting, you know, power of knowledge and knowledge production. Here I want to also raise this tension around the great chain of being, which places a particular hierarchy of the human subject. And we talk about entanglement with world as an even world in ontology. And at the moment, I'm working in a space to revisit cosmogony of Pacific Indigenous creation. And I find it really interesting in terms of this entanglement that already exists in these ways of being and knowing world. So my question to you is also, given this research was in Christchurch, and we do have unique Pacific Indigenous and Māori cultural contexts in ECE, what are your thoughts about ways of bringing together new materialist thinking, post-humanist thinking with Indigenous knowledge, and I guess ways we can decenter our own subjectivity in this generative process you talk about?
That's a really great question, and in fact one that has cropped up each of the, so I think this is my third or fourth outing, and that has been an issue that's emerged each time, and there are no easy answers. And I think, I wrote a book last year, and it was around feminist new materialism, feminist researching gender childhood. And the two guiding questions was what's especially new about feminist new materialism, and what's especially feminist about feminist new materialism. And in fact, there's nothing feminist unless you make it a feminist project. And in terms of new, we owe a debt to all sorts of knowledges, including Indigenous knowledges. But it's, I think, the challenge for me as a white, Western, European feminist is how I tread carefully with that knowledge. So I think there's a real worry and concern that Indigenous knowledge can be appropriated and collapsed into new materialism when they are very distinct. There's lots of productive crossovers, but there's something that we need to do in terms of our feminist politics around whose knowledges and how are we working with those knowledges. So I'm very cautious personally about working with, I'm very respectful, but I'm very cautious about applying or working with Indigenous concepts and ideologies and ways of being, because it's problematic. Politically, it's deeply problematic. But I think if Indigenous scholars wanted to enter into the field and say, hey, you know, you think you've got something new going on here, but actually learn from us, with us, that would be a very different proposition and the right way to do it. Yeah, so it's messy, and I think it's a real sort of burning issue right now that is kind of bubbling up across the field, the disciplinary field, but across the globe. Like, what do we, you know, the kind of immediate, the bushfires and the sort of devastation, all the Anthropocene, problems with the Anthropocene, you know, we don't need new knowledges. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah.
It's definitely what I'm feeling as well in terms of engaging in this space between. But yeah, even Anthropocene has a particular privilege of the human subject. So, you know, I think like what you said about bringing together and working together is probably good way forward. But I find it quite exciting because this is what's unique in Aotearoa New Zealand, is that we have early childhood spaces that, you know, are embedded on, you know, kaupapa Māori and, you know, also Pacific Indigenous knowledge systems, and that's what I find exciting about it.
Yeah.
Sort of just building on that, you know, we are really lucky in that we exist in a context where we have access to so many multiple cosmologies, and you know, but thinking about, I'm particularly writing about time at the moment, and the way in which you know, Western cosmology is very much invested in that idea of there being a beginning, whereas with Māori ontologies we have te korikori, so there is no beginning, it just keeps on emerging. But what sorts of constraints and cuts and potential do you see in renegotiating those cosmologies within an early childhood context where children don't necessarily have those constraints yet?
Yeah, I guess it's not the children that I'm so worried about, if you see what I mean. I think that, you know, I've written about the queerness of childhood many times, and I think that they're very post-human. They're in the middle, and they're messy, and they're unpredictable, and chaotic, and wonderful, and they're completely intact. They can't, So I don't think we need to worry about children. I think it's the educators and the policymakers and all the apparatus that sits around them. The Ofsted, no, was this the one where I shared the Ofsted? Yeah, it was. They're all melding into one. But yeah, you know, it was like that's where, the Ofsted inspectors are very bound by conventional positivist, developmentalist ideas around, you know, time in your case, but, you know, the child. So it's kind of pushing against those, and I think that's where there's the productive potential to actually learn with and from children. And that's what we don't do, like the kind of adult apparatus that sits around the child, even though it's child-centered, it's not really. We're imposing all these kind of structures and constraints and regulation surveillance on the child that actually, if we were to embrace children becoming in the world, then that would be a more productive way, I think, of these theories and philosophies finding useful expression in early childhood contexts. It's that kind of, yeah.
So sort of like creating non-linear edge cases.
Yeah, totally. But that would be a huge, but actually not, you know, it would, and of course, Veronica Pacini-Ketchwell's written about this, you know, the clocking practices and how we, and the structure and regulation and kind of regimes we put in place don't necessarily have to be the ones that they are. You know, why do we segregate children by age? You know, that's another time thing, and linearity, that they belong in these, which is ridiculous. And other things are possible if we don't impose this kind of logic, Western logic on how things should be in those spaces.
Kia ora, I'm Catherine, and I'm a primary school teacher, and I herald from the UK originally, and taught in nursery, and really passionate about making the links. And in New Zealand, I feel that they turn 5 and they are then parcelled up at 5 years old, no matter where they are on their journey, and expected to be something that they're not necessarily. And we talk about getting children ready for school, but actually it's the school's job to be ready for the children. I wonder if you were able to blue sky think, what would you like primary school to look like in that transition space?
I'd like it to look like nursery. Yeah, I think that, I just think, yeah, it's really curious that you can be an educational researcher for decades and then be so disillusioned with what it is, that, you know, the discipline that is education, or what it currently is in its current form. Yeah, primary education, I think there are spaces and places where there's resistance, and more creative, and it can look more like early childhood, but my big fear is that early childhood is looking more like primary. And yeah, so I don't have blue skies thinking, but I kind of think we just need to do away with educational institutions. Perhaps isn't very helpful, because that's why we're all here and we are in one, but then they're really not helpful in terms of flourishing and being connected and all of these things that we're talking about. I mean, personally, anecdotally, my son recently started secondary school, and absolutely terrified by what happens from fairly liberal primary school with no school uniform, you know, the structure of the day and that sort of stuff, but all of the teachers fairly radical and pushing against some boundaries, and kids fairly free to explore and experiment. Secondary school comes, he looks like a policeman, like he's in a uniform, the hair is short and everything is all, and he's totally embracing all the structure. He loves the fact that he'll get a detention if he doesn't do this, and he must be there at that time, and this is, and it's so I don't know. You know, what I think is important, and then how these regimes can provide some sort of security and safety of a weird sort is really troubling. And but yeah, I'm kind of pondering that at the moment. Like, well, surely you can't like that.
Thanks very much, Jayne. I'm thinking of your plastic chairs. My question's going to lead to the mutated modest witness, or the mutating modest witness, and the becoming. And when I was thinking of the plastic chairs, I kind of quite like the way my own body and space and everything mutates around bench, sand, carpet, slippery floor, wet one too, and the plastic chairs, and it's never kind of bothered in a sense. The big question that I often find when people are grappling as feminists coming into a post-human is the loss of critical feminism and the move away from the identity that you've fought to, same in disability studies or any, you know, you're in a sense up against hegemonic power in society, and you've had to do something about that masculine or Western or whatever else, and then someone tells you, hold it, the subject in its certain and orthodox form is out, you're becoming. And the only thing now that really is still there is that processual ontology, that difference of the What do you think of the thought of the mutating? I actually thank you very much for helping me with Haraway. I really struggle with Haraway. What do you think of the notion that that's actually something to be clear, that we're not swapping a sort of bad guys for a new good guy feminism, which in the last comment you just made, you know, surely you don't like that normative that keeps creeping back into us when we take the ground away from us. I don't know whether I really asked that enough as a question, but
yeah, I'm trying
a comment anyway.
Trying to find a way to answer you without relying on the white men, Deleuze and Guattari, and territorialisation and deterritorialisation, striated space. I don't want to go there. But what does Haraway say about, what do I think about this? I think that what's remained constant in Haraway's work since the 1980s to present day is her identification as a feminist science scholar. And so I guess it involves some sort of reappraisal of what do we mean by feminism, and how do we broaden out that very conceptualization of it as a political project. So it's not so much about identity politics and the individual human subject as a gendered body, but those feminist politics still circulate, and they can still be felt, and they still get produced through these endless becomings. So I think that it's I'm not ready to give up on feminism, but I'm ready to reconfigure it or consider it differently. And I think that's what she's attempting to do through the Mutated ModestWitness, is to say I'm not ready to give up on science, but I need to reclaim it and rework it. So that's how I see it. It's, you know, And I also think it's really the idea of process ontology and becoming is actually really liberatory, because it gives us so much more, we don't feel fixed in the same way as these bounded human subjects that get fixed into discursive places or whatever. You know, there's a freeing to it, which I think is really, and when I talk about hopeful science and a generative science, that's what I mean. I think we can kind of, it's the constant movement and where is this going, and constantly mutating as a kind of really productive thing. But I do think we still need to go back to the matters of concern, the matters of care, those bigger kind of conditions of possibility that kind of frame the whole project.
I think you mentioned earlier in the sense of effect that and I read that as being the sort of the ethical imperative is how to keep open and not close down. I think that's the sort of practice that perhaps as we have conversations that, for example, are gendered in a centre, is how to keep open instead of swapping something bad, supposedly,
Absolutely.
for multicultural good or whatever else. That we get. It's too easy to create the binary. Thanks very much.
Can I please call upon Associate Professor Andrew Gibbons from AUT? He's just going to make some final comments and then we'll close off. Thank you.
On behalf of everyone, I'm going to say thank you. And I'm going to do it firstly by, and there was one concept that was going through my mind through today's session, and that was a concept that you may or may not be familiar with, but everyone else will be familiar with here, and that's the concept of the learning story. The learning story, for me, has taken on a horror that I feel here a little bit more, a bit of relief. I mean, I actually don't have a problem with horror at all, but, so I don't mean horror I do mean horror in the pejorative sense, not in the fun sense. But I was thinking about, what if learning stories could take up some of these key concepts? And I know it's a challenge to put upon someone's work that it becomes a blueprint or a model, but at the same time, I'd love for any teacher or any teacher educator that's working with the concept of the learning story to work through notions of modesty, notions of the masculine and of the objective. Thinking about just what was wonderful and emergent in the way you used images that, and even used there as a term I've come before, as I say it, I feel like I need to critique that. I mean, I've seen research where materials they're photoed in order to do something that was already prescribed in the text, whereas I can feel them resonating in a way that I'd love for learning stories to reflect. And then we listen to these beautiful stories, stories that evoke the chair and the knees and the reflection and the golden arches. So to me, powerful learning stories that I would love to see as being evidence of a shift away from the idea, and this is where I think I did, the idea that we don't need to worry about the children, but we do have some worry to do, and our best worry for children, although now is worrying about the positivistic policies that turn learning stories into the kinds of things they are. So, all the way through our learning stories, which is in my head, and I think that I really recommend, when you're feeling challenged by the mundane or the apparent mundaneness or ordinariness of a learning story, this is a session to revisit, to listen to again, and to share, to take it, to see learning stories as potentially extraordinary. So, thank you very much. And thank you also for those excellent questions. And we've got more excellent conversation